one-sentence summary of the book of Hebrews, it is this: Jesus is better. 3 little words. Jesus is better. That's the book of Hebrews in a nutshell. Now, that leads us, though, to the natural question, indeed leads the author to the natural question that he addresses right off the bat, which is, why exactly is Jesus superior? Why is Jesus better? The simple answer to that question is because Jesus is God. Jesus is better because Jesus is God. Now, in the Old Testament, we are told that God spoke. God spoke to his people. That's what it says right there off the bat in verse 1. Long ago and in many times, or rather at many times, and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. It means when God spoke, he spoke through other men. God would give a message to Moses. Moses would write that message down, and he would give the message to the rest of the people. And this happened through all the people through whom God spoke. This happened through Samuel, happened through David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., etc., etc. And there's nothing wrong with this way of communication. Please don't misunderstand me. You're going to hear me say that a few times in this sentence, but don't misunderstand me. This was not a bad way of communicating on God's part. There was nothing lost in the translation. It wasn't as if God said 5 things. Say, God said 10 things to Moses, and Moses left one of them out. No, that's never the case. God, in his power and his wisdom, is more than capable of making sure that weak and fallible men are able to convey the exact message he wants them to convey, which is exactly what happened in the Old Testament. Men like Moses or David or Isaiah didn't leave anything out, nor did they add anything to the word that God didn't want them to add. It is exactly and precisely what he wanted it to be. So I'm not saying the Old Testament is some way, somehow irrelevant or certainly not bad. But the difference between Jesus and the prophets is the difference between someone telling you about a person and actually meeting that person. You can get a lot of information about somebody if someone else tells you about them, but it's not the same as actually meeting that person in the flesh, shaking their hand, hearing their voice. And so Jesus is superior because he is God talking about God. In the Old Testament, you have prophets telling us about God. In the New Testament, you have God telling us about himself. And so, my friends, when we look at the book of Hebrews, we see the author begins by reminding us of 2 very fundamental truths. 2 fundamental truths that every Christian should know and take to heart and continually remind him or herself of. The first is that God spoke. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke. God is not silent. Our God communicates. He is a communicator. What did he do when he created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? He came every afternoon to speak with them, to communicate with them, to help them better understand who he is. Our God is not silent. He communicates with us. That's the reason, the whole reason or major part of the reason why he created us, to make himself known to us. God spoke, but not simply did God speak. God, when he speaks clearly. Indeed, he speaks as clearly as anyone has ever spoken since the creation of this world. He speaks clearly. What's more, he speaks specifically. He speaks so clearly and he speaks so specifically to us even today through this, his word. And my friends, when we know this, when we know these 2 very fundamental truths with regard to Christianity, you should also know that these truths destroy 2 very, very common misconceptions that we find in the world today, indeed that have existed in the world since even before the coming of Christ. These two misconceptions, they seem to exist on polar opposite planes. They both are grave errors that most of us have probably already encountered in our lives, both in and sadly, at least both outside and sadly all too commonly inside the truth. The first is the error, the conception that many people have that God doesn't speak, or at least when God speaks, he doesn't speak or communicate very clearly. He kind of mumbles. We'll talk about that in just a second. The other misconception that many people have, it's a little bit more common actually in the church, is that not only does God speak, but that God speaks in and through everything. Not just his word, but we can communicate with God just about any way and through anything that we want, that we find meaningful. Now let's look at these two misconceptions for just a moment. The first misconception, the misconception that God doesn't speak very clearly. I'm going to say this is the misconception of skeptics, people who either believe God doesn't exist or that God is a very vague and mostly unknowable being. Now, these individuals didn't either totally deny revelation, or at least they deny that God at least speaks, again, very clearly. They say that God doesn't communicate, or at least is not a very good communicator. When you say this, you are also saying that, well, if God doesn't speak very well, then it's kind of up to me to figure out what he's trying to say. As if God is a simpleton, simply mumbling his words, and or a young child. Remember what it's like, most of us know what it's like to try to communicate with a very young child. Dog even, if you will. My dog comes, she puts her foot up on the, I don't always know what that means. I don't know what she's trying to say. Well, many people have a similar conception of God. I think he's trying to say something, but I've got to be the one who figures out exactly what that is he's trying to say. And so many people resort to different things. They resort to things like science. I can understand the world better than maybe I'll understand God. Others resort to philosophy, and still others, increasingly in this age, resort to technology to try to help them figure out the world and therefore figure out what exactly God is trying to tell us. Making this world, by making us, making it the way that it is. And my friends, if you think about this line of thinking for just a moment, I don't think it's too hard to see that this kind of reasoning, this idea that God is a bad communicator, is completely unfounded. And what's more, it is totally and utterly illogical. I mean, think about it this way for just a moment. If God created this world, if he created the plants that we see, the birds, the animals, if he created the cosmos and set all of the planets and all of the stars in their specific places, if he created gravity, if he created atoms, if he created the human cell and the biological cell that exists in all living creatures, if he created things of this complexity, how could he possibly not be able to communicate with us? I mean, have you ever heard of a computer or a computer engineer who created a computer but didn't know how to program it? An electrical engineer who built a radio and didn't know how to use the receiver? No, it's inconceivable, it's ludicrous. It's hilarious if it weren't so sad and if it didn't have such dire consequences for those who believe these kind of things. Oh, my friends, if God is capable of creating us and creating everything that we see both here and in the cosmos, then he is more than capable of communicating with us and telling us the things that he wants us to hear. The greater question, these individuals, is not so much can God communicate, but rather, is he willing to communicate with us? This is one of the many, many differences between Christianity and Islam. Islam believes that Allah created the world and then really didn't want much to do with it. got away from his creation, as far away from his creation as he could, as quickly as he could. That's part of the reason why they revere Muhammad the way that they do. At least Muhammad speaks to them. Allah really, Muslims don't love Allah. It's because Allah gives every indication that he doesn't really love them. That is not the way it is. Christianity is not how God has revealed himself in his word. Again, the Garden of Eden came down every afternoon to speak with and to commune with his people. Question is, can God communicate, but is rather God willing to communicate with us? And the answer, 1,700 pages worth of an answer in my particular Bible, is yes. He is more than willing to communicate with us. Indeed, he is, I don't know if the word is right, but in some sense desperate to communicate with us. I don't know that the word properly applies to him, but I think it conveys the sense of what I'm trying to say. Yet skeptics don't want to hear, certainly don't want to hear this. A skeptic doesn't want to hear simply, not only that God can communicate, but that he's not even simply that he's able to communicate, but that he wants to communicate. Because if that's true, well, then that means that we're not the ones doing the searching. We're not the ones who get to sort of sort through this word and pick out the things that we think are true. I mean, think about it again. It's not, so many liberal scholars love this, that the word of God can, that the Bible can, not to say that the Bible contains the word of God, but it's not all the word of God. You know, they love to do things like, well, that's just Paul. As if Paul went on his own little rants and God was sitting behind and saying, no, Paul, I didn't want you to say that about sexual immorality. I didn't want you to say that about homosexuality. I didn't want you to say those things. Now I'm going to have to wait 2,000 years until some theologian at Harvard or in Germany is smart enough to figure out what I actually wanted to say. Again, it would be hilarious if it wasn't so sad and if the implications weren't so dire for the individuals who think those things. No, God's not sitting over anybody's shoulder saying no and don't say no. This is exactly what he wants to say. We're the passive ones when it comes to this. We don't get to do the searching. It's there. He knows exactly what we needed to hear, and he has said exactly those things. So those are the skeptics. That brings us, though, to the other extreme, this end, which are what I will call the universalists. These individuals believe that not simply did God speak in his word, God can potentially speak, indeed does speak through anything. You know, in the secular world, they will say things like, well, Christianity may well work for you. I find Buddhism. I find I hear God more in Buddhism, or Confucianism, or Hinduism, and there are 1,000 other isms that you are probably familiar with. And still others will say, well, I don't need organized religion at all. God, he speaks through anything. I hear his voice in the rock, or when I look at the rocks, or hear the wind in the trees, or what have you. Still others, well, I hear his voice by looking inside my own heart. You know, listening to my own heart. I hear him through my own personal feelings. God can and does speak through everything. That's what these individuals want us to believe. And yet sadly, very, very sadly, this way of thinking is not restricted to non-Christians. Indeed, there are many, many, many people in the church, even good churches, going to find people who they may not think that God communicates through Buddhism or Islam or something like that, but they will say, well, things like, well the Bible and solid preaching, that may work for you, but there are multiple ways through which I can hear his voice. You know, the Bible may work for you, but I experience him when I'm out on the hiking trail. And still others will say the Bible may work for you, but I experience him through music and through song. When the praise band kicks in, I really hear his voice, or even still, I hear his voice and I feel his presence when I'm the one who's doing the performing. Still others say, well, the Bible may work for you, but I primarily hear it through my service. When I'm working at the soup kitchen, when I'm baking or making food for the next church gathering, or when I'm doing my duties as a deacon or an elder, that's where I hear him. That's where I feel his presence. And still others, and this is very common, sadly all too common in the world, Reformed Presbyterian world, will say, the word may work for you, but I hear him more in my studies. I just get more out of studying Calvin or Sproul or Piper than I do out of reading about the Word, as opposed, the Word itself is a little too complex for me. I get more out of hearing other people explain it, etc., etc. Yet, my friends, simple truth is these things are not true. Simply, these ways of thinking, which are again all too common in the modern evangelical church, are simply not true. I mean, if they were true, then God wouldn't be saying what he's saying in these first 3 verses. God's capable of speaking through the various other elements that we find in the church. Then what reason would he have for writing, for telling us what he does? The opening part of this book. Now, I want to take it aside here for just a moment and say, please, again, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that God doesn't communicate to a degree through the things I've just mentioned, through service or through nature. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been some series of spectacular sunsets this summer. I think it probably has something to do with the fires out west. Beautiful, brilliant reds and pinks and oranges and purples. And it's hard not to look at that and say, God be praised. God be praised. What artist could possibly paint something that looks like that? No, there's nothing wrong with that at all. That is a very, very good thing, a good habit to have. But what I am saying is that these things, as great as they are not sufficient to sustain us in our faith, or at least to give us a very healthy faith. If we seek God through just those things and ignore his word on a regular basis, then we are going to be extremely emaciated Christians, and we are going to find ourselves having great difficulty dealing with the types of problems these Hebrews were dealing with the resistance, indeed sometimes assaults, the being ostracized by the world, etc. No, God communicates through many secondary means, but these are not the primary way that he speaks to us. The reason why they're not is because they are not sufficient of themselves to sustain our souls. No, my friends, no. When our God speaks, he actually speaks. S-P-E-A-K-S. We as Christians do not use that word metaphorically. All the other groups I've described do use that word metaphorically. They don't mean he actually uses real words. No, when we say he speaks, we mean he uses real, actual words to communicate with us. Indeed, there are, I don't know, millions, I'm sure, in these pages. God speaks, uses real words, and he uses them more functionally than any of us are capable of using them. And so, understand that as Christians, we have a God who speaks. He speaks because he can, because he wants to, and ultimately he speaks because he has some very, very specific things he wants to say to us.